The banker leaned forward and said the word like money made him untouchable. The room went cold. Everyone waited for violence. Instead, Bumpy Johnson answered with 4 words that ended everything. The meeting was supposed to be clean. A private office above a quiet street, numbers on paper, coffee poured without asking. The kind of place where voices stayed low because money preferred it that way. The banker sat comfortably, jacket off, sleeves rolled, confidence practiced. He believed proximity to power made him immune to consequence. Bumpy Johnson listened without interruption. The conversation moved through figures and favors, through arrangements meant to sound temporary but last longer than honesty ever did. The banker spoke easily, as if Harlem were an account to be managed rather than a place that remembered. His tone never rose. That was the mistake. He believed calm belonged only to him. Then he said the word, not shouted, not thrown, delivered softly, almost conversational, as if testing whether it would land without cost, a slur dressed as familiarity. An insult disguised as leverage. The room reacted instantly, though no one moved. Air tightened. A chair creaked somewhere behind them. A breath was held too long. The banker smiled faintly, waiting for reaction, convinced the moment demanded anger. Violence, maybe. At least noise. That was how men usually answered disrespect when cornered. Bumpy Johnson did nothing. He didn't stiffen. He didn't glare. His face remained composed, eyes steady, as if the word had been weighed and already found insufficient. That stillness unsettled the room more than any raised voice could have. The banker noticed it too late. He had believed the insult created pressure. He had believed money protected him. What he didn't understand was that pressure only worked if the ground beneath it shifted. Here, it didn't. Bumpy let the silence sit between them, allowing the word to reveal what it needed to reveal, not about him, but about the man who spoke it. The room began to understand something fundamental had changed. This was no longer a negotiation. It was a measurement, and the banker had just failed it without realizing how quietly. Harlem did not explain itself to outsiders. It never had. The neighborhood did not announce its rules or defend them aloud. They were learned the slow way, through observation, correction, and memory. People watched who moved freely after pressure arrived and who vanished once it passed. Respect here was not demanded. It was recognized. Bumpy Johnson lived inside those rules the way other men lived inside contracts. He understood that Harlem functioned on balance, not fear, on memory, not noise. You could shout and still be ignored. You could speak softly and be heard across blocks. Authority was never about who entered a room first. It was about who decided what the room became afterward. The banker did not understand this world. He saw Harlem as a location, not a living system, a place you pass through to reach something else. He believed money simplified everything, that access erased history and language carried no cost. In his world, rules were written down, enforced selectively, and forgiven easily when numbers justified it. Harlem did not forgive that way. Here, loyalty was currency, protection was proof. A man's worth was measured not by what he owned, but by what he refused to exploit. Bumpy had earned his standing by keeping chaos out, not by inviting it in. Shopkeepers trusted him because disputes ended quietly. Parents trusted him because children came home. Men trusted him because lines were clear, and once drawn, they stayed drawn. Those were the unwritten rules. You did not insult in private what you would not say in public. You did not mistake calm for weakness, and you never assumed restraint meant a lack of options. In Harlem, restraint was often the most dangerous choice available. The banker crossed one of those rules without knowing it existed. By using that word, he did not merely offend a man. He exposed himself as someone who did not understand where he stood or who shaped consequences there. The room felt it immediately. The silence tightened, not out of shock but recognition. This was no misunderstanding to be corrected. It was a measurement already complete. Bumpy did not correct him in that moment. He didn't need to. Correction implied confusion. This was clarity. The neighborhood absorbed the insult the same way it absorbed, whether quietly, collectively, without asking permission. People would remember the tone, the pause, the stillness that followed. Memory would carry it forward, attaching meaning where words had failed. That was how Harlem enforced its rules, slowly, permanently, without appeal. Everyone present understood that forgetting was never part of the design. Here, silence always remembered, and consequences waited patiently afterward. Harlem had been weighed, and it had already decided how the moment would end. The banker believed leverage lived in numbers. He spoke carefully, the way men do when they think caution sounds like control. Every sentence was padded with reason. He mentioned contracts, exposure, consequences that arrived quietly through paperwork rather than force. He assumed this was the language that mattered here. It usually was. Money had a way of convincing men that respect followed it naturally, that wealth softened insults and excused tone. The banker had built his life on that assumption. In rooms like this, it had never failed him. Until now, Bumpy Johnson listened without interruption. His hand stayed still. His expression never shifted. He let the banker finish every thought, not because he agreed, but because silence revealed more than argument ever could. Pressure worked best when allowed to empty itself out. The banker mistook that patience for concession. He leaned forward slightly, emboldened. He spoke of opportunity lost, of doors that could close, of futures shaped by men who understood capital better than neighborhoods. His voice carried the quiet certainty of someone used to being obeyed. What he didn't understand was that money sounded different in Harlem. Here, value was measured in memory, in who stood when things went wrong, in who protected dignity when institutions withdrew it. Numbers could not outweigh those things. They never had. The banker's confidence grew as the room stayed calm. He believed he was winning by default. That silence meant agreement, or at least surrender. He believed pressure had narrowed Bumpy's options. In reality, it was narrowing his own. Bumpy Johnson had seen this before. Men who thought access equaled authority. Men who believed wealth could rename boundaries. They always arrived speaking softly, convinced that politeness made their contempt acceptable. Money had taught them the wrong lesson. The banker crossed the line without raising his voice. He used a word he thought power would protect. A slur delivered casually, almost conversationally, as if it were simply another term in a negotiation. He assumed the room would absorb it the way it absorbed everything else. It didn't. The air changed immediately, not sharply but decisively. Chairs did not scrape. No one spoke. The silence that followed was different now. It no longer listened. It waited. The banker felt it a moment later. Not fear yet. Confusion. The sense that something had shifted beneath him without warning. Money was supposed to dominate rooms like this. Instead, it suddenly felt exposed. Bumpy Johnson did not react the way the banker expected. There was no anger, no raised voice, no threat. Just a pause long enough for understanding to arrive on its own. Money had spoken, and for the first time in that room, it was clear that it had said too much and meant too little. The pause did not rush to fill itself. It settled instead, thick and deliberate, the way quiet does when everyone in the room understands that something irreversible has just happened. The banker felt it first, not as fear but as loss of footing. The rules he relied on had stopped responding. Bumpy Johnson did not move. He didn't straighten his jacket or shift his weight. He didn't look around for agreement or reaction. He let the word hang where it had landed, unchallenged, uncorrected. That restraint forced the room to confront it without distraction. Silence became instruction. The banker tried to recover, sensing the imbalance but misreading its source. He cleared his throat. He reached for another explanation, another framing that might soften what he'd said. Words crowded his mouth and went nowhere. The room refused them. Bumpy finally spoke. 4 words, no emphasis, no edge, delivered evenly as if he were stating something already decided long before this meeting began. The reply did not insult. It did not threaten. It did not negotiate. It corrected. The effect was immediate. The banker understood all at once that money had not been the loudest thing in the room. It had simply been the most familiar. Respect, real respect, did not argue with numbers. It replaced them. And once replaced, they meant nothing. No one raised their voice. No one smiled. The reply had not been meant for performance. It was meant to reset the balance, and it did. The banker felt smaller not because he had been humiliated, but because he had been measured and found irrelevant to the outcome. His leverage dissolved quietly. Contracts, accounts, future meetings, all of it suddenly depended on permission he did not control. Bumpy let the silence return after speaking. He allowed it to finish the work. That was his habit. Words, when chosen carefully, needed space to land. He did not explain himself. Explanation invited debate. Debate suggested uncertainty. There was none. The room adjusted around the new reality. Men who had been neutral shifted their posture without realizing it. Eyes lowered slightly. Attention moved away from the banker and settled where it belonged. Authority reasserted itself without claiming credit. The banker realized then that he had not been negotiating terms. He had been testing a boundary he did not understand. The test was over. He attempted to laugh it off, a reflex more than a decision. The sound did not travel. It fell flat, unanswered. Humor required shared ground. That ground was gone. Bumpy Johnson did not acknowledge the attempt. He had already moved past the moment. He spoke again, briefly, not to the banker directly but to the room, about clarity, about how conversations were supposed to end cleanly, about how respect made business possible, not the other way around. Each word closed a door the banker would never reopen. The meeting ended without ceremony. No hands were shaken. No final threats were issued. None were needed. The banker gathered his papers more slowly than he had laid them out, aware now that nothing written there protected him from what had just been decided. As he left, the room remained calm. No eyes followed him. No one needed to watch. The correction had been delivered. The lesson had settled. Bumpy Johnson stayed seated a moment longer, listening to the quiet return to normal. That was always the sign. When air moved freely again, when tension released without noise, it meant order had been restored. 4 words had done what money could not. They had reminded everyone present who decided how power sounded, and when it stopped speaking altogether. Nothing dramatic followed the reply. That was the part most men never understood. There was no escalation, no raised voice, no visible threat that could be pointed to later and exaggerated. The room simply accepted a new shape, the way water accepts the edge of a stone without protest. What had been tense became settled. What had been uncertain became final. The banker felt it immediately. Not fear. Fear would have given him something to react against. This was heavier. It was the realization that the meeting had already ended, even though people were still sitting in their chairs. Decisions had been made without votes, without paperwork, without needing his agreement. Bumpy Johnson did not assert control by speaking again. He leaned back slightly, relaxed, as if the matter had never required effort in the first place. That posture carried more authority than any threat could have. It told the room that escalation was unnecessary because resistance was already gone. The banker searched for a way back in. He mentioned logistics, timelines, suggested follow-ups that might reopen conversation later, somewhere safer, somewhere money could breathe again. Each attempt fell into the same quiet space and disappeared. Bumpy answered none of it directly. He spoke instead about continuity, about how business worked best when it respected the people it moved through, about how trust, once fractured, did not mend itself with better numbers. His tone never changed. Calm was not something he performed. It was something he inhabited. The men in the room understood what was happening. They were witnessing domination without spectacle. No humiliation was required. No punishment was announced. The banker was being allowed to leave with his dignity intact, and with that dignity came obligation. He would carry the lesson farther than any threat ever could. Bumpy's calm did what force could not. It made defiance feel pointless. The banker finally stopped talking. His papers stayed where they were. He nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. That nod mattered. It meant the balance had been accepted. Bumpy stood then, not abruptly, not to command attention, but because the moment had concluded. The room followed his lead without instruction. Chairs shifted. The meeting dissolved naturally, as if it had reached its proper end. No one blocked the banker's exit. That was intentional. Leaving unharmed was not mercy. It was proof. Proof that violence had never been necessary. Proof that power, when exercised correctly, did not need to chase compliance. It attracted it. As the banker stepped out, he understood something he would never say aloud. Whatever he had planned to leverage against Bumpy Johnson, money, access, influence, no longer mattered. The syndicate would not return to this table, not because they were afraid, but because they recognized inevitability when they saw it. Bumpy remained behind for a moment longer, listening to the room settle back into itself. That was always the sign of success. When calm returned without explanation, it meant control had been complete. No blood had been spilled. No threats had been recorded. Yet everything had changed. That was domination as Bumpy Johnson practiced it, quiet enough to last, firm enough to end conversations before they ever needed to become violent. They didn't announce their retreat. No apologies were delivered. No statements corrected the air. The absence arrived quietly, the way real decisions do. Days passed, then weeks. And the table they once approached with confidence stayed empty. In Harlem, that kind of silence was understood. People noticed before they spoke about it. The banker's name stopped circulating. Meetings that once seemed inevitable were never rescheduled. Messages went unanswered, not sharply, not aggressively, but with a consistency that left no room for misunderstanding. They never came back because there was nothing left to negotiate. Bumpy Johnson hadn't threatened them. He hadn't warned them. He had simply shown them the limits of where money mattered. Once those limits were revealed, returning would have meant acknowledging dependence, and men like that avoided rooms where dependence was visible. The syndicate understood what had happened. Power in Harlem didn't need to posture. It didn't chase validation. It waited, and waiting exposed who needed access more than authority. Any attempt to return would have required humility, and humility was a currency they did not carry. So they stayed away. Police presence remained unchanged. No follow-up questions. No renewed interest. From the city's perspective, order had not been disrupted. Streets stayed calm. Business continued. That calm was all the justification needed to look elsewhere. Bumpy Johnson returned to routine without ceremony. He walked the neighborhood. He listened. He corrected quietly when needed. He never mentioned the meeting again. That omission mattered. It told Harlem the situation was closed, not because it had been erased, but because it had been resolved. People remembered not the words spoken, but the effect. They remembered how quickly confidence left the room, how money stopped speaking, how silence replaced leverage. That memory traveled farther than any warning ever could. They never came back because they understood something too late. In Harlem, power didn't need to repeat itself. Once was enough.